Hello, everyone, and welcome on behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences. I am Clara Davison, and I will serve as your moderator today. So thank you so much for joining us for Book Club. Today we will discuss A Farewell to Arms by Ernest Hemingway, selected because it was one of the most recommended titles by more than 100 Department of English alumni who shared their top 10 book lists last year. So we have received messages from many of you asking about future book club selections. We are excited to share that book club will continue, but we have not finalized future book selections and webinar dates. So as soon as that schedule is finalized, you will receive more information from us via email. A big thank you to our College of Arts and Sciences faculty for sharing their expertise with us today. We have Dr. Angus Fletcher, professor in the Department of English, and Jim Phelan, Distinguished University Professor, Director of Medical Humanities, and the Director of Project Narrative. We are recording this webinar and we will share the video with all of you in a follow-up email. Attendees, know that you are muted and your video is off. To view closed captioning, click live transcript at the bottom of your screen. So if you'd like to share a comment or question to add to the conversation today, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We already have about 60 folks on this webinar, so we will not be able to respond to every comment or question, but we will do our best to address as many as possible. So to get us started, Jim and Angus will share some opening remarks about A Farewell to Arms, including responses to some of the questions you asked during registration. So after their remarks, we will open up the conversation. Jim, take it away.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our session, and thanks for coming. It's a real pleasure to be thinking about spending some time with you talking about this fabulous and somewhat controversial novel by Hemingway. I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience with the book and then make a couple of other general comments and then turn it over to Angus. I first read A Farewell to Arms when I was a graduate student. And I remember crying as I was reading it, as I was reading the ending. And we had an excellent discussion in my graduate seminar, which was directed by Sheldon Sachs. And he talked a fair amount about how Hemingway was trying to write a kind of modern tragedy, and a tragedy, if one had beliefs such as get articulated in the book, that if people bring so much courage to this world, the world has to kill them to break them, and it kills the very good and the very brave and the very gentle first. If you are none of these things, it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry. So if you believe that, then how do you write tragedy and make it meaningful rather than simply having the world, being a representation of the world crushing you? So I thought a lot about that, and then actually what happened in my life shortly after that was that my father suddenly died. And he had a heart attack. So it was, here 1 minute, gone 60 minutes later. And, I was young, I was in my 20s, and I was just totally, devastated by this. And one of the things I did was I thought a lot about A Farewell to Arms, and I thought a lot about Hemingway, and I thought a lot about, do we live in a destructive world? And if we do, then how do we cope with that? And I found the novel to be somewhat helpful in that. I mean, it didn't have all the answers by any means, but it was something that I could go back to and relate and try to think about. And then it stayed with me for that reason, and I started to think about how it worked more, and it's very much connected to ideas I've then had about how narratives work through beginning, middle, and end. And I sort of came to see that this, or at least to believe, whether I'm right or not, is another question, but that there's this amazing arc in this novel in which Hemingway starts with Frederick Henry as this very naive character who mouths beliefs, about the war and about the world that are just sort of inherited or, popular or whatever. He sort of speaks for the military high command at certain points, and he thinks, the war. I'm in Italy, I can't study architecture anymore. I might as well sign up, but it's no more real to me than war in the movies. And he moves from that position to one in which he comes to understand, essentially, Hemingway's idea of the potential destructiveness of the world, and then he has to face that and do something about it. And we can talk about that too. So that's how I come to it. There's a lot more to say about all that stuff. I don't want it to be a sort of a session about my grief and that, but I do want it. I want it to be about the book. But I thought it would start there as a way to sort of indicate a kind of personal connection to what Hemingway did and to why I find the book valuable, and then sort of we can focus a lot on, I hope, on reading it and interpreting it and debating various aspects of it. So I'll stop there and let Angus jump in.
All right, thank you, Jim, and thank you all for joining us. Let me start by saying that my grandfather was in the British Army. He served in Korea, and Hemingway was his favorite author. So naturally, I hated Hemingway as a child. I associated Hemingway with my grandfather, who liked to bond with me by going on forced 25-mile hikes across the bogs and pouring cold water over me and doing other things like that, because he thought it was all in the service of machismo, which was this fundamental value that he associated with Hemingway in his novels. And I, being a sweet young child, wasn't really into machismo and avoided reading Hemingway for many, many, many years until I was in college and I was forced to read it. And I knew, of course, that I would hate it, but I didn't. And I read actually, my first introduction to Hemingway was The Sun Also Rises. And I read it and was just immediately touched by a novel that was so vulnerable, so open, so soaked in grief. And after that, I quickly went on and read A Farewell to Arms, expecting a similar experience. But of course, as Jim has already indicated, the novels are tremendously different. And one of the ways in which they're different is A Farewell to Arms, despite its title, is an extraordinary invitation to hope. It's an extraordinarily optimistic work. And that's not something you feel necessarily by looking at the bare words on the page, or if you were to explain the story to someone, something that they would feel. They probably wouldn't feel very hopeful about it. They'd feel very pessimistic. But nevertheless, it is something that you feel while reading the novel, or at least there's an invitation to feel hope in reading the novel. And one of the reasons for that, I think, is because the novel, in its sparseness, is a throwback to a kind of tragedy you see at the end of King Lear by Shakespeare. You see it in Sophocles. And it's a kind of existential work where it pulls back its own heart and invites you to step forward and fill the void with your own beliefs. It calls upon you to have the courage to say, you know what, I think maybe this life can mean something. And if it can mean something, then I'm going to say what it means. Because if I don't, no one's going to say it for me. So that's my general thoughts on sort of snapshot view of A Farewell to Arms, although I'm of course open to, like Jim, hearing what you think and answering any questions I can. And I should also probably say that in addition to being interested in the structure and the voice of Hemingway, his unique way of writing, his unique style, hopefully something maybe we can dig a little into in this session, I was invited onto this panel because a couple of years ago, I was invited by the Hemingway estate and by Colin Callender, who is from HBO Independent and is the producer of the Harry Potter movies, among other atrocities. I was invited by them to do a TV adaptation of A Farewell to Arms. and to rethink the novel so that even as we remain true to the novel, we adapted it to our current moment. And so that's something I also have in my head, is very much the relevance of Hemingway to now, but also the real challenge of adapting Hemingway to the present. So if you're interested in that, or you have thoughts, or maybe there are some aspiring screenwriters who are interested in adapting some other novels that you like, if that's a conversation that you'd like to have, I'm very open to talking about that too. So thank you all, and I will turn the baton back to Clara.
Wonderful. Well, thank you both so much for those insightful comments. We'll now open up the conversation. So everyone in the audience, feel free to submit any questions or comments you'd like to share using that Q&A feature. All right, we have a question from Carson. Please comment on writing style. It took me a while to maintain reading with the short, almost staccato thought type of writing.
Yeah, so maybe I'll say a couple of things and then Jim can leap in because Jim has more intelligent things to say. But, you know, famously, Gore Vidal called this novel a kind of quintessence of idiocy. Basically, Hemingway had boiled down language to these incredibly elemental, stupid atomic beats, which he then kept relentlessly repeating over and over again. And, you know, the opening paragraph, which I'm sure hopefully all of you did at least manage to read before arriving in class today, the opening paragraph is a study in tautology. I mean, I don't know how many times the word leaves is repeated. Jim probably does, but over and over and over again, Hemingway returns relentlessly over and over and over again to the same simple words and the same simple formulations. And this basic style is, of course, familiar from Hemingway's earlier works, which are often thought of as being journalistic, although that's honestly not necessarily the term I would apply to them, but that simplicity and that accessibility. And so broadly, what I would say is the novel is playing a little bit of a mind trick on you. It's being very simple, and that simplicity is telling your brain, oh, it's very clear and evident, and that everything here, therefore, if I just open my mind, I will follow all along, and it will be an easy, simple narrative. And then already in the first paragraph, it's going round and round and round in circles and getting very frustrating and not making an enormous amount of progress and making you think, something is going on here under the surface. Either the author has completely lost control of the narrative, or there's something here which isn't so simple at all. And so really the simplicity of the narrative is an invitation and a challenge. And it's also, I think, what makes the novel so much like our modern existence. I mean, our modern existence, it's all boiled down, it's all very simple. We all know exactly what we're supposed to do. And then we start to follow it, and then we get caught in circles, and we're not actually sure what we're doing and why. So this is a long way of saying, lean into that quality of the storytelling and hang with it as long as you can, because the novel acknowledges that. And the novel places a lot of its emotional and intellectual work in that odd combination of simplicity and inscrutability.
Okay, great. So just to build on that a little bit, I think one of the things that Hemingway's doing with the narration is actually setting up, especially in the beginning, setting up this difference between Frederick Henry as a reporter and recorder and not an interpreter. And then Hemingway inviting us to interpret, right? So for example, famous, right, we think about the famous first paragraph. In the late summer of that year, we lived in a house in a village that looked across the river and the plain to the mountains. In the bed of the river, there were pebbles and boulders, dry and white in the sun, and the water was clear and swiftly moving and blue in the channels, right? So here's Frederick just recording what Hemingway is presenting as a kind of, image of sort of pristine nature, right? Okay, so then what happens? Troops went by the house and down the road, and the dust they raised powdered the leaves of the trees. The trunks of the trees too were dusty, and the leaves fell early that year. Okay, so it's arguable, right, that Frederick is just recording this, and he's not making any kind of causal connections between sort of this idea of the invasion of the army into this natural scene and its disruption of nature, right? The leaves fell early that year. That Frederick's not aware of any of that, but Hemingway is inviting us to make connections that Frederick is not making. Okay. So I think you could see this maybe even more dramatically and interestingly in the last sentence of the first chapter. And here I think too we can get into maybe the relationship between style on the one hand and voice on the other. So, at the start of the winter came the permanent rain, and with the rain came the cholera, but it was checked, and in the end, only 7,000 died of it in the army. So here again, we have that same sort of thing, the recording. Okay, at the start of the winter came the permanent rain, with the rain came the cholera, but it was checked, and in the end, only 7,000. Well, this only, how do we read only 7,000? And also in the army, right? Wait a minute, the cholera came. But in the end, it was checked, and only 7,000 died of it in the army. So who says this kind of thing, right? This is Frederick kind of parroting some official line that's trying to minimize, the effects on the army, right? The only concern is with the army, and the idea we can toss off 7,000. It wasn't 70,000, so it's only 7,000. And here I think we can see that Hemingway is suggesting that Frederick's sort of adoption of these values is problematic. And then I would say, if you go to the last sentence of the book, where we have the same style, but I would say a different voice. So after a while, I went out and left the hospital and walked back to the hotel in the rain. It's the same thing, no adjectives, no adverbs, this and this and this and this. But I would suggest, I don't know, you can check this against your own experience, that it feels different from the first chapter. And I think we could talk some more about that. But again, I think there's something underneath, right? And just briefly, I would say, here's Frederick, going back to what Angus said as his opening, part of his opening remarks, here's Frederick offering to fill in the gaps. Here I am, I've lost Catherine, which is essential, and my son is also dead. I've got nothing to live for. My whole world is gone. And yet, I can take these small actions. Very different from only 7,000 died of it in the army.
We have a comment here from Susan. I was surprised at Angus's interpretation of the novel as being optimistic. Jim seems to have felt differently. I did not cry, but I did think it was sad. Sad in that here is a young man who starts out invested in war, and later, after experiencing the senseless brutality, he runs from the war. I see this book as an indictment of war. We also have a question from Judy. Please explain how the ending is optimistic.
Sure. Well, to be clear, I would not want to impress my approach to the novel on anyone, but I should start by talking about what I mean by optimistic. I don't mean optimistic in the sense that when you watch a Disney movie tells you that true love will make everything all right. I mean optimistic in a very precise sense that comes out of the 19th century as a response to Romanticism in authors like Schopenhauer. And Schopenhauer reads King Lear in a very specific way. And he says, most people find King Lear to be very depressing because the king starts out at the beginning as a king, and then he loses his family, and then he loses everything. And then just at the end, when you think he's going to get back his one daughter, she dies, and then his heart breaks. And then you're left with three people standing around on stage who have given up and kind of meander off to the exits. And everyone says this is a very, very depressing play. And Shakespeare clearly had just kind of given up at this point in his life. But I think differently, because I think what is happening here in this play is the same thing that's happening in Greek tragedy, like Oedipus. And what's happening in those plays is piece by piece by piece, the novel or the play is peeling apart all the artificial things that we have used in our lives to give ourselves meaning. It's peeling back the clothes and the customs and the artifice. And at the end, to refer back to what Jim said, we're still standing. We're still standing at the end. And Frederick has, I think, to guide him into this optimism, the example of Catherine. Catherine, to me, is really the center of the novel, not Frederick. This may make me different from other readers, but to me, the novel is really about Catherine. Catherine is somebody who has undergone a terrible tragedy prior to Frederick meeting her. And Catherine is someone who has come back from that with this belief that she can briefly make her own joy and happiness in the world. And it may not last, but she will seize it because that is her opportunity. And I think her example inspires Frederick to think that he can do that. And that's why he makes this jump out of his kind of ironic, hard-boiled sort of soldier way of life. And he jumps into this idea of romance. And what happens at the end is when she dies and his child dies, he is given this choice. Am I going to remember her in the rain? And if I am going to remember her, what was the gift that she gave? And the gift she gave was belief. So when I say it's optimistic, I don't mean it's optimistic in the sense that everything's going to be all right, or that there's a kind of magic key to making us all happy, or that there is a heaven or anything like that. What I'm saying is the insight at the end of the novel is no matter how bad it gets, there is a heroic opportunity for us to keep going. And by keeping going, to meet other people who have made that same heroic choice and gradually, piece by piece, to turn it around. And so to that extent, I completely agree that it's an indictment of war in the sense that it doesn't like the fact that humans are imitating the natural world, which I think to Hemingway and to Schopenhauer is in a state of war already. And what it's saying is, you know, we could do different. We could do different. So that's what I mean by saying it's optimistic. And I think the fact that none of us drop dead at the end of the novel is the kind of ultimate proof, I guess I would say, of its optimism. Because if you can look at the tragic heart of the novel and keep going, you've sort of proved Hemingway's point. So anyway, I'll turn it over to Jim, because I think Jim has a slightly different but related reading of the ending and why it's not a kind of descent into nihilism.
Right. It's right. Why it's not a descent into nihilism. I think it's a tragedy, right? It's and I think you know, I mean, there's a way in which I don't want to sort of strenuously disagree with Angus putting Catherine at the center of the novel. I think, you know, good things come from doing that. But it seems to me that because we start with Frederick and end with Frederick, and he sort of guides us through, and we're following what's happening to him, and then what's happening to him and Catherine together, you know, that ultimately Hemingway is sort of inviting us to make him the center. But again, it's not a major issue. Here's why I think it's not a tragedy in which there's no hope, right? And it has to do with a kind of maybe, you know, overreading of the last part of the novel. But I'll just contextualize what I'm going to say about that by pointing out that Hemingway tried lots of ways to end. And he finally settled on this one. And I think he made a good decision. But one last line, or last two lines, was that all there is to the story. Catherine died, and you will die, and I will die, and that is all I can promise you. Right? Now, if he ends there, it seems to me it's a very different ending than the one we get. And I think before we get to that last sentence, it's worth thinking about what happens right before that, which is that, Catherine, he knows Catherine has died. He knows his son has died. And Catherine's in the hospital room. Her corpse is there. And the nurses don't tell him, you can't go in there. And he says, no, I'm going in. And he goes in. What does he do? Right? He lies down next to her. But he's got this idea of some kind of romantic final gesture. And then he reports, right? But it was like saying goodbye to a statue. And so this hope for some kind of final romantic thing is completely dashed. And it's like the last step, right? And you just think about what happens in book 5, right? And the whole, childbirth story, right? Child dies, Catherine's in distress, Catherine dies, right? And this is the last step in there. But instead of ending, that's all there is to the story. Catherine died, and you will die, and I will die, and that is all I can promise you. He ends, after a while, I went out and left the hospital and walked back to the hotel in the rain, right? There's something of Frederick actually taking action in the face of what he knows and what he's experienced that I think Hemingway wants to suggest that Frederick is on his way to becoming one of those who are strong at the broken places. And that's why I think it's not simply a story of the way the world crushes all of us and there's nothing we can do about it. And why he rejected that other ending about Catherine died and you'll die and I die and that's all there is.
Yeah, just to kind of pick up on that a little bit, since I don't know, Clara, if we have another question. I think another way of thinking about this is if you want the novel to be an indictment of war, it has to be more than just an indictment of war. It has to provide us with an ethical alternative to war. It has to say, well, what are you doing instead of making war? And I think part of what I think Jim and I are suggesting is that there is an invitation to a different kind of heroism at the end of the novel. And what the novel is saying is there is still room in life to be a hero without killing people. There is still room in life to have courage and bravery and endurance and all those qualities that have been misapplied to war, and instead experience them in our relations with others and our relations with ourselves. And if you can embrace that final line in both its despair and its endurance, I mean, Frederick really has nothing left at the end. I mean, he has given everything. He has
Lost everything.
He's been brought out of a state of cynicism into a state of hope, and he has had those hopes completely smashed. And it would be reasonable for him in that moment to go back to the army. He'd say, look, this was a bad move. Those guys had it right. I should go back to the second page of the novel where it says only 7,000 guys died. That kind of hardness of heart, that's clearly the way to go ahead. That's what I learned in boot camp. But instead, he doesn't. He doesn't do that. He picks himself up and moves on. And I think were Hemingway to overplay that note of heroism, it wouldn't be as strong for us. Because, in order to join Frederick in that heroism, we need to be in that same place and keep going. We can't be told by a narrator who comes in and says, there is hope, don't worry about it. I mean, this is the sort of famous thing for those of you who are Shakespeare heads like me, that Nahum Tate did when he rewrote the end of King Lear. You said, oh, King Lear is a very good tragedy. But it's just, people don't understand at the end that it's hopeful. It needs to be rewritten with an actual happy ending. And then people will find it hopeful. And this play by Name Tate, this revision of King Lear, became the version of King Lear at the end of the 17th century, and then held the stage all the way through the Enlightenment. And Samuel Johnson, the esteemed literary critic, famously said, well, it's so much better than Shakespeare's original. But what we've since come to realize is, no, you lose the power of tragedy. To go back to Jim's original point, tragedy isn't about making our lives sadder for the sake of making our lives sadder. Tragedy is about accessing that sadness and giving us strength. Tragedy originally comes to be in ancient Athens. If you go back, if any of you have ever had the luck and the chance to go back and visit Athens, this is a city, which for we have got, our remaining lingering shreds of democracy from. And it's a city that is built on a rock. It's built on a rock where nothing can grow. Athens, for almost its entire existence, had to import wheat in order not to starve. And every few years, this city gets sacked by Thebes, gets sacked by Sparta, over and over and over and over again. And yet, what gave them the mental endurance to continue saying, it's better to be free, it's better to be independent? Well, it's works like ancient tragedy, because the opportunity of ancient tragedy is to go through the horror and come out the other side, but feel that you're with someone. I mean, that's why tragedy is always in a communal space. And I think that's why Jim wants to resituate Frederick at the center of the novel, because I do think at the end of the novel, we can feel like we're going through it with him. So that is, I think, the alternative to war that Hemingway envisions, the sort of alternative to heroism.
I think just if I could jump in a little on the war thing, right? I think it's very much an anti-war novel. But what's interesting about it is it's not just an anti-war novel. And there's a way in which at the beginning, right, Frederick he's clueless about the war and about love, right? And one of the things that Hemingway does is he shows how Frederick's love for Catherine eventually helps, partly because of her experience, because she is strong at the broken place from having lost her fiance, and she knows about the nature of the world. And by hanging with her, Frederick comes to see that. But one of the tricks and one of the challenges that Hemingway has, I think, is to try to show how the sort of the folly of war and the destructiveness of war is not simply confined to war, but it's part of the way the world itself works, right? And Catherine is crucial to that, and Frederick's involvement with that. So one thing that's really, I think, powerful for me is there's this juxtaposition of Frederick in the first part of the book, when he has the conversation with the ambulance drivers, Italian ambulance drivers, about war and defeat, right? And Frederick is spouting the conventional wisdom that no, we must fight, and so on. And the ambulance drivers are saying, well, actually, what happens if we lose, right? War is worse than defeat, right? And then sure enough, the mortar shells come and Pacini gets killed and Frederick gets his knee blown up, right? And then he goes and he spends his time in Milan with Catherine, and they have a fine time and all that. And then he goes back to the front, right? He's still thinking, oh, this is my duty. I need to go back to the front, right? He still hasn't sort of fully realized that being in Italy and speaking Italian isn't sufficient reason to become a soldier in the Italian army. And then he talks to the priest, and basically he takes Pasini's position, right, from their earlier conversation, and says, we'd be better off losing, right? And he says, his line is something like, I do not think, and then I talk and I say things that I have found out in my mind without thinking. And I think the implication is that, well, how did he come to this? And I think the implication is that he came to this by spending all that time with Catherine in Milan.
So again, feel free to submit any questions or comments you have using that Q&A button. One of the questions that was submitted during registration is, what is the role of the opera singers in moving the narrative forward?
So that's a good question. And it got me thinking, because Clara did share that with us. And I think there are a couple things. One is that the scene with the opera singers gives us a contrast between Hemingway, Frederick and Ettore, because they're two Americans in Italy who joined the war, right? Now this is less about the opera singers, but it comes out of that scene. And what we have is Ettore, who's gung-ho, right? He's all in, right? And he wants his medals, and he's going to get more medals, and sort of all that, right? And then we get Simmons, who's also a non-Italian, and what he's doing is something different, and he's trying to pursue this singing career. And there's this question about whether he's any good, right? And it just seems to me that what Hemingway is trying to do there is sort of chart out these parallel paths and situate Frederick kind of in relationship to them. I also think that in that scene, that when there's that initial conversation among them all, right, there's this contrast between Frederick's interactions with them and his interactions with Catherine. And one of the things that Hemingway is going to do is eventually make it this, two against the world, or two alone in the world, for, Frederick and Catherine in Switzerland. And I think there we can see, a kind of, the difference in sort of the quality of, feeling and so on that Frederick has with Catherine and what he has with these other men. But why opera? I'm not so sure what's going on with that, and why that particular mode of art that he brings in.
All right, our next question is, how do we understand Hemingway's misogyny in the novel?
Well, I'll start. I think this is a very complicated question, I think, and there's a lot to say about it. I do think, the charge that Hemingway is misogynistic has merit here, right? But I also think there's a countervailing movement in the novel, because he uses Catherine as the character whose beliefs and views of the world are closest to his, and he uses her as sort of crucial in the education of Frederick, to come to understand the way the world works. And also, I think he uses her as this exemplar of somebody who's strong at the broken places. But at the same time, I think, the idea that, okay, Hemingway, is writing Catherine in a way that's, she represents a kind of male fantasy, and sort of always, this, even extreme things. I'm trying to merge myself with you so that I would, I wish I had gonorrhea, that whole thing. Well, wait, where does that come from? And what, really, Hemingway? You know, those kind of responses.
Yeah, and I'll just say, I mean, I think that there are many, many, many different types of misogyny. I don't think we want to just say misogyny is a thing. I think there's a lot of, and historically speaking, misogyny is a very flexible tool of oppression that has kind of metastasized and morphed in various different ways. And I think part of what's interesting about what's going on in A Farewell to Arms is Hemingway is rejecting an earlier tradition of misogyny, but he is also himself, as Jim has said, a misogynist. And the earlier tradition that he's rejecting is a romantic tradition. It comes out of writers like Goethe, who have this intense idealization of women as saving them. And there's this sort of total disembodiment of women, and this idea that there is a perfect, pure woman out there whose entire and sole function is to save the man from himself. And if only the man can find that woman, he'll be okay. And every woman that he encounters upon his journey who isn't that perfect woman is a failure and a disaster, and there's something wrong with her, and he must cast her aside in pursuit of this perfect woman, who in the case of Goethe, if any of you have read Faust, is only realized at the end as the woman that, of course, our hero has murdered and then has been resurrected by God in the form of an angel. So this is the sort of romantic misogyny where the only perfect woman is the woman that we kill and then is resurrected as an angel to save us from ourselves. And I think what you see in A Farewell to Arms is that sort of stereotype set up in Catherine as though she is this sort of like perfect saving woman, but then she is humanized. I mean, the reason that the novel is a joy to read for me is because she is an extraordinary character. In the same way that Shylock is an extraordinary character and Shakespeare is deeply anti-Semitic. The character itself, herself, is extraordinary. And so I think, one of the things that happens in the novel and happens in a lot of very powerful literature is it does get away from the author. The author has certain intentions, the author has certain ideas, certain things that he's trying to do, and then life breaks through. And I think one of the things that Jim has said powerfully and that I agree with is that the novel does not see war itself as different in a lot of ways from the rest of life. Life is itself a destructive act. It's a terrible act. And the novel is about trying to punch through that and get at what's really underneath. And I think in his desire to get to what's really underneath, you get these enormous flashes in Catherine of what that underneath is. And that's not to say that that redeems or excuses Hemingway's behavior, but it is to say, I think we can hopefully hold both in our heads at the same time, that Hemingway was not necessarily particularly enlightened in his view of women, and that when he was allowed to sort of talk about women, he would say a lot of things, but that at the same time, as a writer, he was able in moments to capture something. Having said all that, I wouldn't read A Farewell to Arms as a feminist novel, nor would I say that if we were looking to instantiate a new feminism, this would be the place to start. I think, my view of literature, which again may be different from everyone else's, is that a work of literature has done enough if it has given us one thing. And that it's unreasonable to go into a work of literature expecting it to do everything correctly. I mean, that was sort of the fallacy of the Romantics, was that somehow you could create the perfect work of literature that would do everything. I think really, the way I think about literature is the way I think about a library. You can pick any book off the shelf and say, well, it's totally inadequate. It doesn't do any of these other things. Well, that's true. But then you say, what does it do? And if it does one thing, then I think it's worth its place in the library, because altogether. So that is a way of saying, I do not condone, the politics of Hemingway, but at the same time, there is something extraordinary, I think, in the novel that is valuable in spite of that.
Right, and I think, it is worth, asking questions about, whose experience is valued and these kinds of things, and what are some of the, sort of presuppositions that Hemingway brings to the telling of this tale. And, there are, I think, other, beyond what he does with Catherine, the whole attitudes of men towards, sex and, the girls at the front, quote unquote girls, and, all that. It does indicate a certain, kind of problematic, patriarchal view of the world.
Our next question from Joshua. What are your thoughts on the priest when it comes to the message of hope/despair and endurance through times of war? Given Frederick befriended the priest while claiming to not love God, and while others wouldn't, would you say this adds anything significant to his character?
Yeah, I think Hemingway does a lot of really interesting things with the priest. I think, I think one of the problems that Hemingway has early on is to make Frederick a sympathetic character, because he says things like only 7,000 died of it in the army, and because when he kisses Catherine and she slaps him, and he says, "Oh well, I can see how this is going to play out," and sort of all this, right? That there are a lot of things about Frederick that are not particularly likable. I mean, the fact that he's telling the story helps in this regard. But the priest is one, who, the fact that the priest befriends him, I think, is a kind of, gives the reader some faith in Frederick as a redeeming character. And then I think it's interesting too that the priest becomes he uses the priest as a kind of surrogate for a lot of his own ideas when he's not using Catherine for that. So when the priest comes to visit Frederick after he's been hit by the mortar trench shell, and they have a conversation about what happened to him, and Frederick says, "Oh, it was an accident," and they're talking about the war and who makes the war and so on. Frederick says, "Well, that was an accident," and the priest says, "Even wounded, you do not see it," right? That Frederick doesn't get what's happening in the war, and so on. And also the priest's association with the Abruzzi, right? This area of Italy, which is so clean and cold and beautiful, right? And he wants Frederick to visit on his leave, and Frederick doesn't visit. And that's an indication of something that's deficient in Frederick. But there's a way in which, sort of, when Catherine and Frederick get to Switzerland, they're in a kind of the equivalent of the Abruzzi, right? And then Hemingway also uses the priest to have that conversation about the war after Frederick comes back from Milan, and all that time with Catherine. It's with the priest when he's talking about, when he utters that line about, "I never think, but then when I talk, I say things that I have found out in my mind without thinking," and that whole flip of his own attitude toward the war. And I think the priest also sort of, he represents another kind of way of dealing with the destructiveness of the world, of just kind of soldiering on. He just does what he does, and he puts up with all the abuse and verbal abuse from the soldiers and so on.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, we should be said that just as there are many different types of misogyny, there are many different types of priests. I take the question sort of at its core to be asking if maybe Hemingway is expressing some kind of, ideological interest or belief in something kind of greater or bigger, or if there's kind of that possibility for hope in the novel. And that may be the case. I think, Hemingway is a complex figure. But I think, just to kind of agree with what Jim is saying more broadly, the priest seems to be in the novel sort of what priests are in war generally, which is a figure out of place who, I mean, it's a strange thing that you would go to war without a gun. I mean, it's a strange thing that you would be in the trenches and not be trying to kill. It's the same kind of paradox that Hemingway explores in his other writing when you're a medic in the trenches. You know, you're there to try and heal, you're trying there to help, you're there to try and save. I mean, this is the kind of function. And I think that the priest is holding out through his endurance this quality that we all have, which is this sense of there has to be something more than this. I mean, there has to be something bigger than this. And the sort of relentless rejection of the priest is, I think, something that causes us to feel a pang as we read it. Not that we necessarily are compelled to believe in what the priest believes, but just the fact that he's there and he believes in something, I think is important for the novel and the work it's trying to do.
Susan asked, is there some part of the novel that is a contrast between the patriarchy, the war, and matriarchy, nursing? But the nurse dies, although not directly killed by the war.
Well, I'm going to make myself very unpopular by revealing that I don't actually read novels allegorically. And this is one of the things that's a little quirky about my approach. So, you know, and I think Jim might take me to task for this, but I sort of indicated this earlier in the fact that I'm doing an adaptation of Hemingway and that my background is in Shakespeare. The way that we're often taught to read literature today is to interpret it and to try and find out what it means. And when we do that, we often end up by turning it into a series of representations or themes. And therefore we are attempting to kind of deduce its moral message or what it's saying. You know, is it condemning this or condemning that? Or you know, does this character represent this or that character represent this other thing? I don't know why we would read literature to do that, because who on earth is interested in Hemingway's opinions on these things? You know, that mode of reading known as interpretation was developed to read the Bible because people believed that the Bible was written by God. And in that case, you would have enormous interest in knowing what God thought was true and false. But when it is transplanted, this kind of model of this sort of this hermeneutic model of reading and interpreting is translated onto literature, it puts us in this kind of quirky position that we're trying to find truth in somebody who has no more access to it than ourselves. And so, you know, my interest in literature is not trying to find out sort of the kind of deeper allegories in it. You know, normally when we do that, I mean, so my background, I should confess, is largely in neuroscience. And what we know is that when people interpret novels, they almost always do so to confirm their own prior beliefs. And this is the same with almost everything. You know, we see this today in our politics, we see this with everything. Whenever you interpret something, you're just kind of reaffirming your own priors, you know. If you don't believe in God, you read the Bible one way. If you are a Catholic, you believe another way, so on and so forth, you know. So what I'm interested in is an alternative. And this is sort of one of the things that Jim and I have very strongly in common is we have a narrative approach. And in particular, my interest in is what's the use of literature? What's its function? What does it do? And there's different ways you can think about that. But one way you can think about that, as I've already indicated, is how novels help us with problems we have in our own lives, maybe by reframing those problems, maybe by giving us resources to work through them in terms of grief, in terms of tragedy. In terms of a novel is a private place where we can acknowledge our deepest fears and the things we don't normally want to acknowledge, like perhaps life is meaningless, like perhaps everything we love is vulnerable to being destroyed, and that there's a way in which that belief, which is so terrible that we couldn't admit it in a public space, we can, in the protected space of the novel, admit it because we are supported by the novel and can kind of work through those beliefs and those griefs. So that's one way to think about how a novel can be used as opposed to interpreted. Another way is to think about how to adapt it. I mean, the origin of storytelling, both in the Greeks and before, was adaptation, which is to say someone would tell a myth and then someone else would rewrite it. So famously, all the Greek tragedians rewrote all the same myths over and over. They retold the story of the Trojan War. This is why we have no single authoritative story of any of these events, because the idea was, how do you retell the story? How do you recraft the narrative? And when you think about literature that way, what you realize is that our lives are stories. And if we want to change the direction of our lives, we change the stories in our lives. And literature gives us this opportunity to take old stories and change them and shift them and find the parts that are working and add other parts in. And so one of the reasons that I agreed to adapt A Farewell to Arms is because I'm interested in that process, just in the same way that anytime a new staging of Shakespeare is performed, what the director and the actors are doing is they're trying to not do it literally, but they're trying to recreate it. They're trying to use it. They're trying to adapt it in some way. So this is a kind of broad way of me saying that I think one way of reading literature is to try and find the message in it and what it's saying. But the other way of reading literature is saying, what can it do for us? You know, it's this enormously powerful tool that our ancestors have given to us, that previous generations have given to us, and that did things powerfully for them, helped them through their lives. And in the case of A Farewell to Arms, to me, it's not so much a story about, you know, war is good or bad or so on and so forth. It's a story about the fact, to go back to some of the things that Jim has said, the tragedy is inherent in life. We have created a scientific world in our minds where we are outraged and appalled by death. You know, we think that every time someone dies, we could have saved them, or that there was some way that tragedy could have stopped. And we have this attitude in our lives because we have been so tremendously empowered by the scientific world that somehow when something bad happens, somebody did something wrong. You know, when a plane goes down, when a war breaks out, somebody did something wrong, we have to identify them and punish them. But I think what Hemingway is saying, whether that is true or not, because we're humans and because we're imperfect, there is always going to be tragedy. There is always going to be disaster. There is always going to be grief. And that grief is going to break you to your core. Things are going to happen which challenge you to continue breathing. They go so much to the depth of who we are. And that is really the function of tragedy, is to create a space where we can acknowledge that, where we can embrace that, and then we can move forward. So to me, ultimately, if this novel doesn't work for you, I hope there are other tragedies, other novels that put you in that place where you are looking at your darkest fear, but you are carried through the story by it. So that in the process of reading, whether because you're bonded with the characters or whether you're bonded with the narrator, you go through that process and come out the other side and realize, I'm still going, I'm still telling this story. And so that is sort of broadly the way I approach the story. And I feel like I have talked too much, so I'll let Jim come in and see if he can maybe refine that or add anything else more valuable.
So a couple things. In terms of the matriarchy and the nurses and so on, I think it would be worth sort of a closer study of how Hemingway, treats the nurses and how Frederick does and so on. And the fact that Catherine is a nurse, I think, is significant. But it's also the case that the nurses are of different kinds, right? Miss Gage, is sort of on Frederick's side, and she seems to be a really good nurse. Miss Van Campen can't stand him, and there are consequences to that. The nurses in the hospital when Catherine dies are, they don't play a very large role except at the end there. So I don't think there's a sort of a single kind of nurse position, but it could be worth looking at that more closely, and then trying to think about that in relationship to some kind of opposition between matriarchy and patriarchy. The other thing, just to pick up on what Angus is saying, I mean, I think, I think agree with a lot of what Angus says in the sense of trying to resist allegorization or going some one-to-one correspondence between, character and abstraction idea X or abstract idea X. But I also think, and I think this is sort of implicit in a lot of what Angus said, that one of the things that fiction can engage us with, and I think Hemingway's fiction does too, is with ideas, right? What is the nature of the world? And if we answer it this way, what follows from that, and so on. But what it does is it works like with thick description, right? So here's the nature of the world, and here's how it gets experienced by these characters, and then they make, these choices, and we can think about these choices in these different ways.
We're almost out of time, but I wanted to ask both of you for a quick closing thought about why the novel endures.
Well, I think a lot of the things that we talked about today, I think, the vision of the world, the possibility of finding a way through this, sort of encapsulated in the idea of being strong at the broken places. I think the style and the voice. I think Frederick's journey and the way in which he, it's this kind of Bildungsroman in which this sort of callow young man who doesn't understand the war, the situation that he's in, what it means to be in love, et cetera, and comes to understand those things, and then has to face, the consequences of living in a destructive world. All that's very moving. I think it's all very relatable. I think, the anti-war things are also very relevant. But I think the sort of the philosophical thing of sort of thinking about why we're here, how we relate to the world, how do we respond in relationship to what we decide about the way the world is. All those things are still very much alive.
I mean, I think it's a novel for hard times, a novel for broken dreams. I think Hemingway was hurt badly by his life, and I think ultimately it damaged him to the point that he no longer wanted to continue. But I think the fact that he wrote this novel at all is an extraordinary sign of his heroism and the heroism that inspired him and the people that he saw. And so for me, because we also live in difficult times, the fact that Hemingway could write this novel and the fact that his characters could keep going is the reason that it keeps going for me.
Jim and Angus, thank you so much for sharing your time and your expertise with us today. A big virtual round of applause from all of us. Everyone in the audience, thank you so much for joining. I'm sorry we weren't able to get to all your wonderful questions, but hope you'll be able to join us next time. We'll be sharing more information about that. Thank you all. Have a great afternoon.